Welcome again to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, another Zoom edition. And with me again today, I have Vianna Chambers from the Calimesa Seventh-day Adventist Church. I have Nick Snell from Azure Hills. I remembered this time. And we have Michael Kelly with us from Mount Rubidoux Seventh-day Adventist Church in Riverside, California. It's wonderful to have all of you with me again this time. And we've been looking at the year-day principle. We've been talking about Revelation 12:14, where you have the time, times, and half a time, reference to Daniel 7 and so forth, and how the year-day principle was very, very central to Seventh-day Adventist background and history, but that sometimes the younger generation today has some challenges, and we'll tackle that in the course of this program. But before we do, normally in programs like this, we don't want to date the program by talking about current events too much, but it seems to me something going on right now is so significant for God's people, so significant for the United States and for the world that I would like to address that just a little bit. And Michael, I'm talking specifically about the racial injustice and challenges, the George Floyd situation, a great tragedy. How are these things affecting your church community and the African American community in general? Help us understand.
Yeah, I think the best way I always explain to people is a little while ago, years and years ago, over 15 plus years ago, I actually had the chance to meet Michael Jackson. The actual Michael Jackson. And I remember when I'm telling that story to people, nobody would believe me. The young lady I was dating years and years and years and years ago when I was in college was with me, and no one believed our story, even though we said the exact same thing and we shared it. No one believed our story until we showed them the picture. And I think what makes George Floyd so unique is for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I think America and the rest of the world finally saw I've been talking about. Before it was just like, not really, just like people with Michael Jackson story. But when I showed them the picture, it was like, wow. And I think now America and the rest of the world has seen for themselves what we've talked about. And I think the Christian community is very familiar how one person's death can bring a community and a group of people together. So what we just believe that this is done is it's an opportunity for us to really be the church. I think the church should be leading the front on these issues. And I don't think it's an accident that this happened when the world was at a standstill for all intents and purposes. So our complete attention is on it. And so now I just think we need to continue to look at the Bible to guide us in how to be at the forefront of the issues. The last thing I'll say is, when somebody's hungry, you don't pray for them. You actually can pray and give them food. And when it comes to justice, this isn't an issue we just pray about. It's something we actually put our works behind as well.
Mm. Well, what can people like Nick and me that look like us, what can we do to make a difference at a time like this?
Yeah, I think there's been a big part where people have said, listen. And I think that's important. But you did say specifically, like Nick and yourselves. And while you guys are, my white brothers, I don't put you in the same category as someone who's completely ignorant to this, because you know about the history of our church and Black conferences. I think as being people of the Bible, particularly Christian Seventh-day Adventists, you guys know about this idea of justice. So I think the most important thing is to be alongside and also take the lead in conversations. Yes, be a listener, but also be active in speaking up and being a voice for those who have been talking. It's one thing when I, as a Black person, say these things. It's other things when both of you all say them the same things as well, because it just has a different ring and a different tone.
Mm-hmm. Well, it reminds me a little bit of a good friend I had back in college. His name was Gregory Allen. And we were really good friends back in college. And I remember back at that time, that was civil rights movement and so on. And we were involved in some of that. And it really struck me a little while ago. I said, 50 years have gone by and we're still doing this. Mm-hmm. When I attended a program to, at Loma Linda to consider what had happened and what we could do about it. And And yet one of my colleagues at Loma Linda said, yeah, he says, but it wasn't wasted. He says the younger generation today is different than our generation was 50 years ago. So it made a difference. It did matter. It wasn't wasted effort. And that was encouraging to me. Yeah, these are challenging times. And the book of Revelation is all about a different kind of world, a world that is governed by other-centeredness. That's what love is. Love is not a feeling. Well, it can be, I mean, how you interpret it, but love is ultimately other-centeredness. And the opposite of love is self-centeredness. And when we divide ourselves up by race and divide ourselves up by political parties and divide ourselves up in so many different ways, that's corporate selfishness. And at its root, I think racism is a spiritual problem. It's a problem of the heart, and is not likely to be resolved by legislation and things like that. But the book of Revelation talks about a path that the church can and should be doing that will lead all people to see that other-centeredness is really the crucial thing. And when we grasp how God looks at us, how God's love is other-centered, when we grasp that, it changes the way we treat other people. I kind of ran on a little bit here, but I'm passionate on this. Anybody else want to say a word?
Yeah, I feel like I grew up in a very multicultural place at Andrews University. There's Adventists from all around the world there, and having friends and from different races and backgrounds. And even still, I feel like this time that we're in is so valuable because it's heightened my awareness, and I really have been motivated to look into it more, and watch some documentaries, read the book Let Justice Roll by Dr. Perkins, and it's really been so helpful to me. And so I've really appreciated the invitation to listen, and appreciate the invitation to partner as well. And I do want to join in this. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and one thing, nowadays when I go out for a walk and I see a person of color, I never used to do this, but now, just stop at appropriate distance, of course, and just say, how are you doing? Mm-hmm. Are you okay? And I don't mean just COVID-19, but just the whole dynamic. People may wonder, I think some of white folk may look at us, aren't they making a huge deal out of one incident and so forth? But what I don't think people understand is that when you live in some fear, every time you see a police car, and yeah, we all kind of, just a little bit with a police car, but it's different. If you're black, it's different. And there's a real fear. And when you've lived a whole life with that, a national incident like this can totally change your psyche. And I'm beginning to sense that myself. And I appreciate, Michael, you sharing with us. And the connection with Revelation is the bigger picture of what God is seeking to do. The tree of life is for the healing of the nations. That means the healing of relationships among people. I don't think racism will be totally done at the second coming. I think when we get into the millennium, we're going to be seeing people there that maybe we didn't want to live with here or didn't like being with here. And the tree of life is a place where people are going to mend those relationships, not as sinners, perhaps, but still we bring our personalities with us and our lack of understanding on many things. So, yeah. Well, thank you, Michael, for sharing from the heart. We appreciate that very much. So we're talking about year-day principle here in the book of Revelation. Now, you see, now I think we can feel what Nick and Viana said last time. It's like, I'm not sure this subject is all that relevant, Yet it was burningly relevant. And if we were to say, well, what the Adventist pioneers understood doesn't matter, what so many Christians for hundreds of years understood Doesn't really matter. Maybe they were just mistaken. But I'd like to suggest that the year-day principle does have a solid basis. It doesn't have to be biblical in the sense that the Bible itself states the principle, but there's a thing called theology, systematic theology, where you look at history, you look at the scriptures, you look at experience, you look at psychology, you look at sociology, try to bring all those things together and say, what are the implications of what the Bible is teaching? I think when you do that, you see something here you might not have seen before. Now, Seventh-day Adventists come with a perspective of two things bring to this subject. Number one, the idea that God knows the future and is willing to reveal it. And two, that he sometimes does that with a series of historical events. All right, those are two fundamental things. There's no statement in the Bible that says the year-day principle. But if God knows the future, and if he's willing to share it, then reading it in that way is not impossible. All right. Any of you want to react to that?
Yeah, so I think here's always been, I think, the question for a lot of generations, and like you had prefaced in the earlier part, that maybe a younger generation looks differently as the way they're viewing the scriptures. So with what you just said, with the idea of God knows the future, and sometimes he uses history to show that he knows the future. If you took away the year for a day principle, does that take away that truth and that reality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the question. And I think something would be lost. In another sense, maybe you can get what you need out of the Bible without knowing that. There's a lot of people who'll be saved that don't know much theology. So isn't there a song about that? Don't know much theology. But anyway, Viana, you said you had questions. Go ahead, Michael.
No, I guess I was saying, like, I don't think that principle, if moved away, even our theology, I still don't see it crumbling with that being moved away.
Okay. Viana?
Yeah, I would even want to go back before the Adventist interpretation of the year-day principle. I know the Adventists maybe are not the only ones who see it that way, but maybe the original readers. And do we have any maybe insight on what it meant to them when they saw these times?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, as I mentioned, there were Jews of Jesus' day who saw that they were about 490 years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. So they said Messiah is coming, and I think there was a writer called Hillel Silver, a Jewish scholar, who studied expectations of the Messiah in the first century, and that Daniel 9 was a live issue back then. And then you had Christians around 1250, looking at the 1260 days. Maybe that's years, you see. And then you have, as you get toward the French Revolution period, people looking at the 1260 and saying, well, it's interesting that a 1260-year period in the middle of Christian history would make a lot of sense, because we're seeing that, there was one dominant church for about 1200 some years, and it seems to be in decline and no longer have the influence that it was. Could that be what is happening? So it seems that history and current events have always driven it. But the question I have is, is there something in the Bible that would equate days and years? Can you think of anything in the Bible that would lead you to make such a connection between a year-day idea? Year-day thinking.
Wasn't there something about Isaiah or Jeremiah laying on their side for a certain amount of time, and then the other side, and it was days for a year?
Mm-hmm. That was Ezekiel chapter 4. Yes, okay. Ezekiel was the one. And he was lying on his side because he was supposed to illustrate the history of the monarchy. And the monarchy in Israel was about 420, 430 years. It lasted from Saul to the destruction of Jerusalem. It was about 425 years, something roughly like that. And so he was supposed to lie down to illustrate that whole history. Here's an interesting point, though. Yeah, Michael?
Doesn't it also, I think, Numbers 14 as well? Numbers 14 and 34. Just as you explored the land for 40 days and were unfaithful to me, now you roam the desert for 40 years. So there's that connection there. 40 years, wilderness, 40 days, 40 years each day.
Yeah.
However, aren't those literal? Like the literal 40 years wandering in the desert, the literal 40 days getting to know the city. Those are literal. Those aren't interpreted as symbolic, yet they're the same numbers. But are we like stretching it out to say, hey, there you go. Like they're talking about days, they're talking about years. Maybe they're the same thing.
Well, aren't they connected in Numbers 14? That 40 years was the time you wandered in the wilderness, so this 40 days is equivalent to the 40. Do any of you have that text in front of you?
Yeah.
I think it's Numbers 14:34. Just read it for us, because I think it does actually make a connection.
No, it does. So Numbers 14, 34, and this is a New American Standard Version. According to the number of days which you spy out the land, 40 days, for every day you shall bear your guilt a year, even 40 years, and you will know my opposition.
Oh, okay. So this was a consequence. The spies spent 40 days searching out the land and came back with a negative report. And because of that negative report, the people decided not to go in and take the land. So God says, okay, for that 40 days, there'll be 40 years when you're just sort of wandering around because you didn't want to go in. I'll wait for a generation that's ready to go. So yeah, it's a year-day thinking is what I would call it.
But it's not that I'm not sure that can be interpreted as a conversion necessarily in symbolism, because both of those time periods are very, very literal. Whereas in Revelation, we don't have a very literal, and if we do, great. But it sounds like we're moving into symbolic 1260 days versus the literal 40 years being in the desert.
Of course, if you read the 1260 days as years, that is symbolic, isn't it? You would expect that number not be exactly literal. So that actually, I think, is an argument one could make for the year-day principle, that the fact that it's 1260 days is too obvious if it's taken literally, that perhaps a symbol is intended.
I guess I would say that the challenge, because I hear what you're saying, like Exodus is not being symbolic. It's a consequential. It's like, you did this for 40 days, so I'm going to do this for 40 years. But that same concept hermeneutically, I don't think is being used in prophecy, because, Exodus is not this prophetic kind of language or anything that's being used. It's actually God responding to an action versus being prophetic, as maybe he would in Daniel 9:25 versus, and also, Revelation 12.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as a slam dunk proof for year-day principle, neither Numbers nor Ezekiel works, because first of all, Numbers is not a prophetic text in the sense of giving you that broad principle. God is simply saying, for 40 days you did this, therefore the next 40 years you're going to do that. But he makes the connection between the two. So you have an action of 40 days produces a result of 40 years. Now with Ezekiel, an action of 40 years produces a result of 40 days. So it's the opposite. So these two texts together are not stating a principle of how to interpret prophecy, but what they are illustrating is that Hebrews thought days and years were equivalent. You see, you have 6 days and then comes the Sabbath. You have 6 years and then comes the rest of the land, and so on. So there's year-day equivalencies are there. And so what's clearly biblical is not a year-day principle as such. What's clearly biblical is year-day equivalency or year-day thinking. And you know what? This goes outside the Bible. Hammurabi, the king, reigned 30 years in Babylon. This is way before Nebuchadnezzar, around the time of Abraham. And we have documents, they're written on stone, actually, before papyrus, etc. There are these stone documents that tell us they threw a party of 30 days to celebrate his birthday, one day for each year of his reign. So that year-day thinking is more than just something that happens in the Bible. It was a very ancient concept. And so you have year-day thinking, and you have these texts that support that. So how do you get from year-day thinking to a year-day principle? Anyone have a thought?
That's a good one.
I mean, what you were saying earlier, just seeing how it can line up. It's like, oh, it kind of worked in some situations in the Bible. We see the connection, and we're seeing the connection in our history as well.
So you have biblical support for reading it that way. Not a biblical mandate, but you have biblical support for thinking, something said in days might be years. And there's a lot of biblical texts where it talks about days and then says, well, we mean years. So that's very, very common. I think there's a dozen or so places in the Psalms, et cetera, where in poetry, it'll talk about days and then switch to years. And it's talking about the same thing. So yeah, Michael.
So would that mean then, because I really enjoyed what you said, I wish I had tweeted that out because that was really good. But would that mean then, based on that interpretation, because there's that kind of thinking, we would have to see the context to determine whether or not we should apply that thinking.
Right.
The context of which it's in there.
Yeah. So
because the Bible is not consistent when it talks about prophetic time versus literal time. There isn't always that year-day principle being used.
Yeah. And I would suggest it's probably not wise to, every time you see the day in prophecy, to think that that's a year or a number of years. Because, for example, you have the day in which Babylon falls in Revelation 18, I think. Is that a year? Is that what it's trying to say? Or, you have 5 months of the locusts. Is that supposed to be 150 years or not? I have a suggestion. Let me share with you the way I handle this, and then you guys come back if it doesn't satisfy. All right. First of all, I would suggest that unusual numbers are a trigger. The Bible writer using numbers that we don't normally use. Okay. When you have a child, does any parent say, oh, this child is 1,260 days old? No, you'd say what? 3.5, right? Would you ever say, oh, this child is 2,300 evenings and mornings? Probably not. You wouldn't even say 42 months, right? You do months up to 24, but after that, it's a 2-year-old, right? So, oh, my child is 16 months old. Yeah, that's okay. But 42 months kind of crosses the threshold into a weird number, all right? Sure. So I suggest for Seventh-day Adventists, the critical year-day passages all have weird numbers. 1,260 days, times and half a time, 2,300 evenings and mornings, 70 weeks, You wouldn't say that either. It would be, a year and a half, something like that, you see? So I think one trigger would be the use of unusual numbers, Viana, would point you toward a symbolic use for that term, days. A second thing is that you needed to balance long-range prophecies. Let's go to Daniel 7 for a moment. In Daniel 7, you have Rome. Well, you start with Persia, and then you have Greece, and then you have Rome, and then you have this little horn, all right? And the little horn is the biggest, baddest character of them all, okay? Greece and Persia and Rome all lasted like hundreds of years. But suddenly you get to the little horn, and it's 3.5 years. It's not proportionate, okay? And not only that, if the prophecy goes to the end, you have a big gap. You have a little horn, 3.5 years, and then what? Then you're at the end. But if it's a year-day principle, it fills that whole period in, you see. And so at least from the Adventist pioneers' perspective, that 1260 days as years was necessary to bring them all the way to the 19th century where they were.
Interesting.
Now, another thing I would suggest is that in each of these references, there's 5 references in Revelation to 42 months, 1260 days, times at half a time. Every time it's in a chain prophecy that starts with John's day or Jesus' day. In chapter 11, it starts with John. You must prophesy again. And then it goes into chapter 11, and then you have the 1260 and the 42 months. So it starts with John's day. Chapter 12 starts with Jesus' day. Then comes 1260, and then you have the end time in chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 13. So the 1260, 42 months is always sandwiched between John's day, Jesus' day, and the end. So filling that whole period as a period of years, I think it makes the most sense. And it's always the middle stage. It's never the end stage or the beginning stage. So that would suggest to me that the year-day principle is a legitimate reading. One last thing, and then I want to hear your reactions. I make a distinction between exegetically compelling and exegetically defensible. When a church comes up with an idea and a doctrine, it should be able to defend it from Scripture, but not every teaching is going to be compelling. Does that make sense? That can we accept that something is defensible from the Bible? I mean, is there a better interpretation of Daniel 8 than 2,300 years? I mean, I've looked at a lot of interpretations. They're all a little bit slippery. Daniel 8's a tough text. So to be able to defend it, I think, is necessary. But a church doesn't have to prove everything. It needs to have enough that it can be offered to people. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a better way to probably explain and share that that hey, we can defend it, but not necessarily have to prove it, because I think it does put you in a different mindset, and also the reader who might be challenged by some things. You're not in this position where, again, like I said, someone left the church because of 2,300 days. Was slippery for them. But I love how you said there's just enough there, though, that is not as slippery as maybe some of the other interpretations out there. And then we could just defend those points that aren't as slippery. I think that'd be good.
And for the younger generation, it will never mean to you what it meant to those who actually went through those days in the 1840s. Mm-hmm. For them, it was vital to not only have the right year, to have the right day. That was kind of critical. That can never be as critical to us as it was to them. But to honor what they saw and to see what God did in bringing us where we are today, that's a marvelous thing. And believe it or not, our time is up again. And God's prophetic surprises keep on coming. God be with you till next time.